This is, in fact, the #1 place where technology thought leaders hang out and share real-world advice on various tech topics relevant to you, our listeners. Today, I have some very, very dear friends and colleagues on the panel that I'll be introducing here in a minute. But before we get kicked off with that, I did want to share a little bit about some of our conversation today and what we're going to be talking about. Obviously, this global pandemic has continued to capture the attention of many of us, and we're going to do an episode focused specifically on some of the security techniques that you can employ to help get through this time. And so first off, we're going to look at how bad actors are setting their sights on potential victims during the outbreak. We're going to look at how they're gaining access to organizations' IP through many of the platforms that they use in a normal business day. And then lastly, and for sure most importantly, we're going to talk a little bit about what your organization can do to understand if you are compromised, and more importantly, how to reclaim a strong cyber posture. We've seen lots of things in the news here just in the last week, a couple of them that I thought were interesting to today's conversation, and really starts to blur the lines between federal regulatory bodies and the internet, which we know is free and open. We've seen many organizations, registrars in general, have now blocked over 80,000 pop-up domains. And so this is something that the registrars are doing. There was one out of the UK in particular, Nominet, as well as Aaron here in the US, and different domain registrars that are stopping and preventing organizations or people or bad actors from firing up domains that are COVID-like to be used for malicious activity. And we'll talk a little bit about how you guys can take that one step further in protecting yourself. We've seen massive organizations ban different video conferencing technology based on some of the breaches that we have seen here in the last few weeks as well. InfoSec magazine put out a wire yesterday that cyber attacks are now up 37% over the last month, and those are coming in different forms, specifically the phishing space, malware, 0 days, and that sort of thing. And then I think the last thing that is at least of interest is we've even seen some organizations now be sued for security vulnerabilities. And so if you're in the application space, there are some techniques that you can employ to make sure that what you are delivering to your end customer is in fact secure, and we'll touch on that as well. So today, again, I appreciate the panel coming on. Some of you guys have been here before, but we do have a new and distinguished guest, Howie Feinsilber, out of the Western NC region, is joining us today and will be part of the conversation. So Howie, thanks for coming on. We welcome you and look forward to chatting with you about some of the things that you're seeing out there as well. Mike Talbert, one of the senior architects on the solutions engineering team at Catalyst, who really helps guide our customers across the globe with all kinds of different technical strategies and really focuses on the destination. And Steve Rattacasa from the Low Country of South Carolina, filling the same role as Mike, but specifically focused in a couple of other areas, endpoint specific as well as cloud. So these guys are certainly going to add a lot of value today. So again, thank you guys so much for joining today, and we look forward to what we would call at least an interactive conversation. So again, just to recap, what we're going to talk about is how these guys, these bad actors, are setting their sights on victims. We're going to look at where they're gaining access to organizations. We've seen 3 or 4 just in the last few weeks at Catalyst, where we've helped organizations identify those and then remediate them. And then again, all of this focused on the destination of, if we woke up in your shoes, how would we be protecting our environment and what we could do to reclaim that posture, so to speak. We'll have a little content here to help kind of guide the conversation. But these are just some of the things that we're seeing out there. So just to get a little bit more detail in this targeted approach. So again, we've seen over 40,000, I believe is the number today, COVID-19 themed domain names pop up. And so what this does in organizations is it lures users into clicking on links and doing different things that in many instances can be harmful. We'll talk about fake applications specifically that are being deployed even through the app stores, Google Play, Apple, that are supposed to be sanctioned and policed, and some of those are sneaking through as well. And then lastly, and most broadly, we've seen these targeted phishing campaigns that are really doing some havoc and wreaking, lots of damage inside of organizations as well. So my first question really is, on these three things specifically, I wanted to ask Howie. Howie, you've worked a lot in the security space. You boast multiple certifications in that arena. And we have lots of organizations that we've been helping, kind of protect the user community in which they're responsible for now that they're away from the flagpole. So, I guess I'll phrase the question this way. Obviously, you're working with clients and different folks, but in your experience, what is really, if you can only do one or two things, or there's budget constraints and that sort of stuff, what are some of the things that organizations can do just from a general web filtering best practice to be able to detect and block some of this malicious activity that we see out there in the wild?
Hey, thanks, Jesse. Yeah, so one of the key things I think that businesses should be doing for their remote users is focusing on the endpoint and having some endpoint protection, because that is where a lot of backdoor malware gets in. And that's usually from, as you say, phishing campaigns, clicking on email links, or browsing to web pages that have links to malware. So we often have deployed a number of Cisco products in this realm, but there certainly are other vendors out there that are providing other solutions. We've had real good success with rolling out endpoint protection in terms of, or with the product Umbrella. The Cisco Umbrella is a great way to have protection on what DNS domains that machine is actually allowed to connect to. So I don't know if everyone knows, but you can actually, for personal use, run a free version and do some web filtering just in your home. But from a business standpoint, you can get Umbrella licenses and put those on your remote users' machines, and that will provide filtering for categories, but also malware. So you can block those connections before they even happen. So if you're going to a web page and it's got links to these other domains that are spun up just to introduce malware on the machine, those will be blocked before the connection even happens. So
Gotcha.
That's one method. But yes, there's certainly other endpoint protection mechanisms that can be done. Another would be the malware protection. Cisco AMP, again, is another product we've deployed quite a bit, and that will block malware that tries to get on your machine. So if you did click on that link, it starts to download that file, that malware protection is going to check to see, well, it's going to look at every file that comes into that machine, and it's going to check a signature to see, okay, is that known malware or not known malware or unknown? And if it's unknown, in the background, it does some checking to verify that if it's clean or not. So those are two big things that I think are really important for protecting endpoints.
Gotcha. And then so at scale, this Umbrella, for those of you that aren't familiar, that was like that open DNS acquisition that Cisco made. And certainly there's other reputation-based tools out there, but essentially this is using some sort of AI or ML at scale, right? And so as they pick up on bad signatures and on bad sites, they're able to replicate that across their globe, essentially, and protect, the rest of the users that may be second, third, fourth in line to click. Is that kind of essentially how that works?
Yes. Yep. We'll check on URLs, verify those against the lists that Talos, which is Cisco's security organization, compiles and updates, keeps and verifies those against the categories that you defined within your policy on Umbrella.
Great. And even though many, up to 85% of the workforce is now seen in a remote capacity, that users are now away from the flagpole, and again, what we've coined this perpetual snow day, there are still ways to enforce that kind of corporate policy across these, personal endpoints or, corporately owned endpoints across the globe. And that's a big thing. And we've seen all of these cloud providers really making a mark and helping, the situation for sure. So I appreciate your comments on that. One of the other things that we've seen, at least in some of our accounts that we work with, are users downloading and installing what we would call fake or malicious applications. So some of this stuff is coming in again through the App Store, or click on this link to download this, or get the latest COVID-19 map in your area. All these sorts of things, right? That can be, in some instances, harnessed through a sanction site even. And so I was going to ask Steve Rattacasa in particular how organizations are dealing with this. So lots of the organizations that we support, at least at Catalyst, have things like a UEM, an MDM, some sort of endpoint management on the mobile side. And when I mean mobile, I mean specifically iOS, Android devices. What are you seeing, Steve, in that space where organizations are able to employ policy or protections to kind of help, with this second bullet here of fake apps being deployed?
Yeah, so being able to at least inventory the applications specifically for mobile devices at least gives you the insight and the knowledge that, this is the list of applications. There are some times where you can trend out and see like, okay, is there applications that are appearing that we haven't seen before, or applications that maybe we haven't approved? There's always the capability and option of whitelisting applications, which in instances like this may have merit. I know a lot of times whitelists can be a little bit of an administrative challenge, but in times like this where there's a very clear potential for an attack vector to exist with very specific messaging, starting to whitelist the applications that are required, and then helping to do some security diligence to verify the applications that are COVID related that you do want to allow, and simply adding them to the whitelist is another strategy that you have. And I think the whitelist strategy, or the known executables, is a very common thing that we see in Windows environments as the endpoint devices. So certain tools have different capabilities than others for sure, but I think most of them are going to give you at the very least an inventory of the applications that are installed. Some organizations, they have for corporate-owned devices their list of applications that they allow and that they deploy, and that's very simple in those instances. But for those that are embracing a more bring your own device type of thing, being able to identify what those applications are, in certain instances, profiling those and determining if the behavior of the application looks appropriate or potentially malicious, and then isolating those if they do look malicious, are all capabilities that should be evaluated to help kind of clean up and secure that security posture.
Great. And we know that many of these remote devices in many instances aren't being connected to the corporate networks, right? A lot of times people will use their more laptop-centric devices to connect into work environments. So what I mean by that is we still don't see a lot of VPN deployments or private connections coming back from these mobile devices. Steve, have you seen anybody take it a step further and perhaps just control the policy so tightly that during this time they're not allowing application installs, or do you feel like that's a little too much of a tyranny approach?
So yeah, it's a little bit more of the the age-old battle of security and user convenience, and that's, I haven't seen anybody go that far to say like, okay, well we're just not going to allow any new applications to be installed right now. I know that there are a lot of bad actors acting right now because again, there's a clear, if you put yourself in the shoes of the bad guys, there's very clear opportunities for them to take advantage of the situation. But even with that as kind of the context, I haven't seen anyone go so far as to say no new applications are allowed. And I think a lot of times, especially in those situations where the users are having their own devices that they're bringing or that aren't connecting back to the network, you tend to have less control of those devices, even in a MDM type of environment. than you do if it's a corporate-owned on-premise deployment, as is more traditional. So even if you wanted to, in a lot of cases, what those solutions will allow you to do is to document and inventory the applications and then report or generate alerts that say, hey, this person has this application, so then you can take direct action, but it won't automate the action taken.
Gotcha. Okay. Good feedback there. Thanks for your insight, Steve. Mike, this next one's for you, and we've seen, as with other profile, events that have been big in the news or different types of things that just lure and grab the attention of potential user. Even the FedEx and UPS deliveries around Christmas time still seem to be one of the largest vectors that we see and help defend against with our clients. We've seen a lot of targeted phishing and malware distribution campaigns come in through mail, and we still see organizations that are having really a hard time and a difficult time in protecting against this. So obviously with all three of these things, educating your users is a huge piece of what we strongly recommend at Catalyst. But what are we seeing organizations do to help protect against these targeted phishing campaigns, where it may be even redirecting you to these newly spun up COVID domains, so to speak? So again, this is more of a defense in-depth conversation with these 3 or 4 topics. But what do you see in organizations do to help stop and prevent this sort of behavior, Mike?
Yeah, I mean, number one, right? Humans are curious creatures, and so these bad actors out there are definitely preying on our curiosity as well as our fears in this. So really, I think kind of the number one approach on this would be end user awareness training, and keeping that up to date. There's a lot of value in that. If we look at how malware typically enters the environment, that's typically through a user clicking on something they shouldn't have. So being able to educate users in that regard is kind of a first step, but it really is a layered approach. So, ensuring that alerts and all that are being monitored, right? We've seen, breaches happen through email to where, a bad actor gets into the admin account of an email domain and is able to set up forwarding rules and things like that based on specific keywords, right? Especially around gaining financial information. And stuff like that is definitely alerted upon, but a lot of times it's kind of ignored, right? So, in a lot of cases, it's really just a matter of being a little bit more diligent in that, ensuring that you can filter out the noise, and focus on what is important and what alerts are valid and should be acted upon. But that's really kind of the two right off the top of my head that I could think about.
Sure. And would you say that all of these things kind of that we've discussed thus far at least work together, right? So again, not only educating the users is paramount, but also if the email does make it through your corporate filter, so to speak, or your cloud filter, even providing some of these, URL reputation-based services can protect even further should a user click on that link. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. Again, security overall is a layered approach. And there's definitely solutions out there for the different layers that need to be looked at, that can definitely help mitigate some of these attacks and threats.
Okay.
Jesse,
good.
I just wanted to call out. So as we're reviewing the ways that the malicious amongst us are targeting us today, it doesn't mean that they're executing the attack after the secondary attack after they land their malware, right? We can get in the door, but then we can stay dormant for a while, wait for things to settle down, and then execute kind of that stage 2 execution of whatever that attack or malicious intent is. And I wanted to call that out because I think when we get to ways that we can kind of shore up that posture, there's some important considerations to be made there.
Sure, and what you're referring to, Steve, is really dormancy, right? And so a lot of times these things have timers, or they get in and they just sleep for a specific set of time, and then they either coordinate attacks or get truly CNC or some sort of control on the back end when the users aren't ready for it, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
And Jesse, it's Howie. I and one other point to make regarding that this endpoint type protection and the email security protection, it's super important, not just to do the blocking, but also to provide the visibility so that the IT staff can get alert messages, can view reports. Sometimes there's false positives you do have to sift through, but it will give you a better insight as to what may be going on. And again, that user training that Mike was talking about, that again is super important for, like you said, stuff that can get through the cracks. You need that end user to be aware and to be cognizant of all of the types of things that make an email suspicious. So clearly now there's lots of COVID-related stuff, and somebody's urgently trying to get you to click on something. That's a red flag right there. So continuing that education is very important as well.
Great. Yeah, we've definitely seen a lot of organizations kind of step up through their LMS or whatever content management they have, either in an increase in targeted campaigns that are sponsored internally, or just from an education perspective, making folks remediate or maybe pulling those. Many of the customers we work with have an annual viewing requirement based on vertical as well, and some of them are pulling that into 6 months or 3 months or even ad hoc, and messaging that internally. Okay, so across our accounts, at least in the clients that we support, we've seen email continuing to be the dominant space where these folks are targeting our clients. And so because of that, again, we've talked a little bit about some of the things that we can do to protect that, and then we've also seen lots of attacks specifically to people who may have a presence, throughout this thing and aren't in a work from home state. So if you are a healthcare facility, if you're a state or local government, maybe even a life safety organization, we're definitely seeing some challenges there as people are defending against this. And then the last thing that I just wanted to call out is this fraud and disinformation, right? Steve, I think we were talking with a client earlier this week, and they were talking about, some of these forms or sign-up techniques that some of these bad actors are using, so that if you want the report or the latest information, put in your information, and you're kind of just giving away some of the stuff and making it easy for them, right, to actually have some of that, protected information, or at least, user-specific email addresses. What's the guidance that we're giving to our clients around that, just in particular?
Yeah, so I think a lot of those tend to use new domains, and the essential setup is they create what looks like you're signing up for a newsletter. So there's some new registration of domains and email accounts and an email service. They say, hey, if you'd like to find the latest information on COVID in your area, it looks very official. It's a very well-structured attack type strategy. And a user will put in their email address, which provides that email address as a known good email address to the the bad actor, and then increase their click-through rates, right? So from a attack standpoint, where maybe they were only getting 1 out of 100 people in the past, if they can get 100 people to sign up to that, quote unquote newsletter, they might get 80 people to click on it. So they're harvesting some information, and they're making the next step of that attack much more successful. And those are very scary. So there's, again, the defense in depth type of approach. You want to make sure you're securing email for your users. You want to make sure the users are being educated and that they're not falling for some of these, fake signups. And then leveraging tools that can block things at a DNS level, so that if there are some new domains that have been allowed to be registered, we can say, hey, if this domain's existed for less than 30 days, the odds of it being malicious versus not malicious, there's a pretty big, asymmetry there. And let's go ahead and prevent connecting to any of those. And if there's a couple one-offs that maybe it is a brand new domain that we do need access to, then we'll go through the administrative step of whitelisting it. But knowing that, the number of bad brand new domains is probably going to significantly outnumber the good ones, that's not too much of a sacrifice to make.
Sure. Interesting. Interesting. Okay, guys, let's shift gears a little bit to some of the things that I feel like, can actually help our clients. So we've talked a little bit about what we've seen and observed here over the last few weeks in some of these paradigm shifts and how these bad actors are coming after clients and users. One of the things that we've traditionally done when folks are on campus or behind the flagpole, so to speak, is we've been able to look at, kind of user analytics and more behavioral type trends, right? And so this goes back to the Edward Snowden days where he downloaded gobs of information prior to releasing it and that sort of thing. How do we do that in this remote world, right? So we've helped some organizations implement this tunnel all policy to pull traffic back through the organization over VPN and kind of keep that always on, which does provide an extra layer of protection. We've seen some organizations not opt for that and went down more of a split tunneling methodology where they allow native SaaS applications to leak directly from the user's endpoint and only corporate traffic come back. But how do we know, from a detection perspective, as these endpoints are dispersed around the globe in many instances, what should we be looking for, from that context? And Howie, I'll throw that one to you. Are there things on the either endpoint side or even on the corporate side, if they are using that tunnel all methodology, how do we know when something's wrong, when something's different? Lots of our customers have a internal security operations center with many folks that have eyes on glass all day. Some of them outsource to us, some of them outsource that to others. But how do we look at kind of some of this endpoint forensics and understand when something bad is happening?
But one of the big questions there on direction there is if you're doing full split tunneling and all of that remote users traffic is going through your headquarters firewall, or if you have the split tunneling model and that traffic, a lot of their internet traffic is just going direct. So in the full tunnel type scenario, you certainly want to have some next-gen firewall IPS type device that is looking at that traffic that's coming from that remote machine and you turning out to the internet or going to the inside, because that'll give you some visibility into the type of traffic that's going on and will flag malicious traffic. So you've got options for intrusion detection, prevention of looking at that traffic, as well as malware detection, security blacklist, things like that. And then that information you can, if you have the IT staff to work on that, you can get reports generated, you can get alerts sent. In cases of usually larger organizations or even smaller organizations that don't have the staff, an MSP certainly could be the one that's looking at that data as it comes in. And in the model of having a split tunnel, then you really definitely need to have good endpoint protection. And some of those endpoint protections, like I mentioned earlier, like the umbrella, you have a dashboard and you can look at that dashboard to see what's going in and out of that machine, what was blocked, where they were going or where it was trying to go. Another tool that is pretty a new tool out there that I've learned about is Cisco Endpoint Security Analytics, and it uses, if you have any Connect VPN, it uses this called the Network Visibility Module, and that will take tons of data from your machine. It's kind of like NetFlow for the endpoint, so not just the source destination IPs, but actually look at like processes that are running. And you can take all of that data and send it to a Splunk logging server and have a dashboard right there that will help dig through that data and provide alerts and anomaly detections and so forth. So that's another great visibility tool that Cisco is now offering with their AnyConnect. So those are some of the things that I see.
Great, great. So that's almost similar to like an N bar that we use kind of on perimeter edges or on, in the traditional data center or cloud world, right? Where we can get that same visibility on the endpoints, even though they're not, behind the corporate firewall. Is essentially what you're saying.
Correct. Yep.
Good. Good, good, good. One of the things that we've seen, lots of people starting to trend and take a more aggressive approach at is this kind of dark web, filtering and scanning, right? So it's almost like a real-time credit report where you see updates on different things and, FICO scores essentially for your user, community and that sort of thing. And so, Mike, can you talk a little bit about what organizations are doing and some of our clients in this space to kind of step up hey, do we have users with our corporate domain out there that are compromised, and a little bit just on how that works?
Yeah, sure thing. So really how that works is that there's several services out there that offer this to customers, and you can sign up, typically a subscription for that. And what they do is they'll actually go out on the, I'm using air quotes here, but the dark web, and which is where, a lot of bad actors are out there, selling, user credentials and things like that, that they've received from breaches and other, compromised events and everything. So, but it will go out there and based on a domain name, maybe for your organization, and go out there and scan and see, if there's any, credentials or breaches and all that have affected, users that have an email address, with that domain name. And then get reports on that, and then they can go and address directly with that user, what happened, or let them know that, hey, it looks like, their account may have been compromised. And in many cases, it'll tell you how that, or where that information was collected from. So, if it was one of those that maybe they signed up for a, Target newsletter, for example, and when Target got breached here, a couple of years ago, that, it shows up there as, hey, this user's credentials were collected, or this user's personal information was collected from this specific breach. Like I said, there's many services out there, that provide this, but that is one way organizations are kind of trying to stay in front of, accounts that have been compromised.
Great, and you mentioned Target, but there's also been a lot, other organizations, even LinkedIn recently, right? There's a lot of places where people do use their corporate accounts, right? So I do think it kind of goes back to that training as well. All right, good.
Absolutely.
Well, that's interesting because I feel like a lot of people aren't managing that today. One of the things I wanted to talk about, from a phishing perspective that I think is important is, how organizations know when they're being phished, right? And so lots of times our clients have the hook in their Outlook toolbar or in their G Suite or whatever it is, and they can quickly report that information. But Steve, what are we seeing clients do specifically around transparency and visibility for phishing? Is there anything creative that we've either helped with or at least picked up from a client in that realm?
I think, again, a lot of these attacks, they're not just you click this link and then immediately bad things happen. Right? A lot of them is we want to get some sort of malicious payload deployed. And so, a user can click the link that, maybe wasn't too wise to click on, and then some sort of malicious software gets deployed. There's always, I think that's one of the lowest hanging fruits from a security strategy is some sort of email security solution. Those are very easy to come by in kind of a software as a service model today. And those can kind of catch the vast majority of those types of attacks on the front end. And for the ones that do land, and if a user does click, again, hopefully they're trained enough to know not to click or to potentially identify some of those, malicious emails themselves. And then as you kind of filter those down, the funnel gets smaller and smaller, but occasional ones do land. And so the ones that do land, having the ability to kind of map what the connections are, understand what it's talking to, what normal looks like for your environment from a, kind of a baseline of behavior standpoint, and then execute some sort of isolation or segmentation on anomalous behavior. The more automated that is, the better traditionally, because there's less of, you're hunting for very specific things that are taking place as opposed to you're being alerted when something looks malicious. Those are all important things to have, and there's a variety of different ways to accomplish that. But I think the behavioral level is the real key there. There's always going to be some kind of definitions list, right? If this is a known bad thing, very easy to say, if we see thing and we know it's bad, block it. But the more malicious ones and the more sophisticated or advanced ones, they're not going to look identical to the ones that came before. And so being able to say, okay, maybe we didn't recognize this particular, code segment, but maybe we can take it and put it in a sandbox, execute some sort of instructions on it and see what it does, and then map the things that it does to say, is this look normal? Does this look like it's trying to do something wrong or malicious? And then, make a decision criteria based upon that. And then taking that further, if it does land, if it says, hey, it did some things that looked weird, but it's not weird enough that we're going to block it, to then say, this endpoint or this server normally talks to this handful of other systems. But today it's talking to everything on the network. Very clearly, this is anomalous behavior. Let's lock it down. And again, automating as much of that as possible is kind of key there.
Sure, and many clients are still, while focused on the remote users and the endpoints, they've not taken their eye off the ball on their kind of cloud infrastructure or private cloud infrastructure as well. So it's really important, again, to all the listeners that you guys are taking a holistic approach here. And as Steve mentioned, right, stitching all this together is something that's critical. So let's talk a little bit about, just some of the basic blocking and tackling that we can use here to prevent some of these things that we've discussed. So we talked a little bit about, using these cloud services that are at scale much smarter than we are, which is huge. But Howie, on the remote access side, when we talk about an endpoint in particular, be it a mobile device or a laptop or a personal computer that's been brought home, what are some things that top 3 things organizations can do on those endpoints in particular to help keep them safe?
Well, again, the endpoint protection with remote access. So those can be separate modules that run or agents that run on the endpoint devices, but there are combined ones that allow you to do the malware type detection, the filtering, even host inspection. So when that VPN client connects to the head end, that it's checking that the Windows patches are up to date, that if you're running an antivirus or anti-malware or something, that's up to date, the right versions, the right definitions, so forth. So there's some of the endpoint control right there within the VPN client. Those are some of the key things that I see that should be done on the remote access side. And then, as you were saying, with how you're connecting, so a corporation need to make a decision on their security policy if they're going to do a full tunnel type setup with VPN or whether that's going to be a split tunnel, and split tunnel could be done statically via just, okay, these networks go to the head end and the rest of them go to the internet, or you can do a dynamic type policy to say, well, these domains, well, we know Office 365, we don't want to send that back through the corporate office and then you turn back out the headquarters firewall. So you can split tunnel dynamically and say, oh, those domains, just send them directly out the internet, or actually in reverse where you exclude certain domains. But yeah, those are some of the decisions you need to make in how you want to roll out your VPN client.
Great, good to know. Thanks for that feedback.
To add there, Jesse, specific to remote access. So I think VPN is the solution I think we've seen most of our customers embrace. And there's certain elements of like multi-factor authentication that can be layered into that for, an additional level of security. There's also 2 other potential options. There's, kind of a virtual app or virtual desktop type delivery, again, protected with a level of multi-factor authentication, where the servers or systems that are being connected to live in a data center. Users are connecting into it through an optimized delivery protocol, authenticating with multiple factors, and then all of the traditional protection from an endpoint standpoint components can exist in the data center on those systems the users are connecting to their apps or desktops on. And then I think the third option, which is a great option that maybe more groups are considering than we've realized, is if there's a cloud-based offering of the applications that your business runs on, I think those are being heavily considered, if not migrated to, because for groups that weren't prepared and that didn't have the capabilities to deploy rapidly, some kind of remote access solution, if there was an option that allowed their users to just directly connect to it, and they didn't have to deploy, potentially some extra infrastructure to connect to the corporate environment, and they could just execute, a very quick spin up of an application of desired type, in the cloud, that was a very appealing option for many.
Gotcha. Well, great tips, guys, and I appreciate you giving us kind of the whole 360 view there as well. We know that lots of organizations, and I think we kind of covered the endpoint control component there, and if nothing else, outside of the only other thing that I think we got a ping here in the chat was, securing the endpoints further by enabling, disk encryption. Obviously, that will help in some cases if a device was lost or stolen, but appreciate the feedback there. On the data management side, Mike, I'm going to flip this one to you. Lots of organizations think that their data center is in their cloud tenant or in their, private data center, so to speak, but we know in this day and age it's grossly outside of that. We've seen organizations continue to leverage, large, file sharing technologies, right? Like a box, Dropbox. There's 100 of them out there. What can organizations do, to protect that with the third-party apps that maybe people are leveraging in this case?
Yeah, I mean, so in a lot of cases, right, it's the same type of technology in a lot of regards to what you would deploy on premise from that protection, some sort of deal, data loss prevention policies that potentially are built into these, these offerings or cloud-based offerings. The other thing too is, when we see this huge shift towards SaaS type applications, right, there's definitely a layer of security you can have there as well. We typically call that, CASB or Cloud Access Security Broker, technologies that can ensure that, what you are sending in, receiving from those applications is safe and help protect in that regard too.
Great. And that's that kind of reverse proxy, forward proxy stuff that sits in between the instance or tenant and the endpoint and does things like get inside that SSL tunnel and make sure there's no malicious, traffic being sent and that sort of thing, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, good. Guys, I feel like we've kind of beat the user awareness kind of training horse, quite a bit today, and so we'll skip over that. But again, lots of value in continuing to bone up on that and at least provide your users more visibility. One of the things that someone on the team did mention, I just wanted to throw this out there, and of course we'll send this deck out after the call today. But essentially, everybody is aware, and if you're not, a great resource for you outside of some of the guys on the panel today is this NIST framework. And so NIST has published, and it's been around for a while, a work from home best practice, and the guidelines are in 846, and it's something that if you guys have not reviewed, our listeners, please take a look at that. It's a pretty well defined process overview of some of the things that we've talked about today, and maybe a couple others that are specific to your environment. And please do go ahead and take a look at that. There's a lot of good information in there. We recently wrote a blog on NIST updating some of their core profiles to be more relevant and current in today's age. But essentially, there are some good things here if you're struggling with how do you get started? What should I be measuring good against and that sort of stuff? So if you don't have time to reach out for a conversation with someone on the panel, please know that this is a good kind of building block and at least place to start when you're formulating and looking at this to further mature your posture. Well, guys, I know we're out of time. We have a couple of questions that we can answer here over the wire and take feedback. But any closing thoughts from the panel today? Again, thank you guys so much for joining, but just didn't know if there were any Mike specific stock picks that you wanted to recommend. I know we're in earnings seasons again. I didn't run your numbers this time, but I know you're continuing to beat the average. Any closing feedback that you guys want to share with the audience?
I think the defense in depth is one of those things. I know that the security landscape has changed. You'll hear a lot about zero trust architectures, and that essentially means it's no longer just secure the perimeter and everything is fine. So, threats can live and exist well inside of the firewall, and they can be dormant. So having something to catch, the most common risk vectors or attack vectors, things like email, multi-factor authentication. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit that can be applied. Um, Awareness training is a huge part of that for sure. And then, making sure that the different groups, if you have any in-house development, that security is something that the developers are considering at, each step along the way of, the business applications that they're looking to build. And that, everybody understands that while security can be inconvenient at times, the downside is so tremendous that it's worth spending a little bit of time, at each step in the way to make sure that you get it as close to correct as you possibly can.
Good feedback. Anybody else? I do think that while this is kind of a COVID-themed approach, or just some of the trends we've seen at Catalyst, this is not something that is novel or alien to us. This is all things that we've been practicing for a long, long time. Just feel like it just generally what we've seen, it does need to be reiterated as well. Well, guys, that'll wrap us up. I appreciate again to Howie, Feinsilber. Thank you for joining today. We appreciate your insight as true boots on the ground and kind of architecting these systems and solutions all the time. Steve and Mike, frequent on the show. Thank you guys for joining, and we appreciate your time today to the audience. And if nothing else, we will have another open mic series here coming up in 2 weeks. So stay tuned on The Wire and all the social media outlets. We'll be posting that and providing you guys with some visibility. And again, always looking for suggestions. If you guys do have questions, these are very, very client driven around how should we or how do we type of thing. So if you do have areas that you'd like to learn or hear the panel talk more about, we're certainly happy to do that. And if we don't have resources internally, we'll definitely pull in some industry experts, which you'll see here in some of our upcoming shows. So thank you guys for your time today. We appreciate it. We hope everyone stays well and stays safe, and know that we will be back on the other side of this curve here before long. Thanks for your time.